This hearing will come to order. As I told our witnesses a little bit earlier, the scarcity of members here is not a lack of interest in this very, very important issue. But there is a signing ceremony going on at the White House, and the Republican conference has got various things going on, and so we're going different places. But the important thing is that you're here, that we've had a period of time for minority and majority staff to talk with you. We've gotten your written information. We're glad to hear from you today. So today's hearing is about the role of NIST in supporting innovation in the 21st century. As the only federal technical agency with a constitutional mandate measurement, and also the oldest federal technical agency with a statutory charter, NIST has proven its worth to taxpayer investment for more than 100 years. And as technologies have evolved, so has NIST, from developing the thread standards for the fire hoses to the measurement of electricity, and now the digitalization of fingerprints. The list continues to grow. However, the current lab structure dates from 1988, and the technologies of today are much more multidisciplinary and integrated in scope and function. Dr. Patrick Gallagher has announced his intention to restructure NIST to reflect the trends of the past 20 years to accommodate the trends of the next 20. I agree that NIST structure needs to better reflect the needs of the private sector communities it serves, and we intend to make this a component of the American Compete legislation. NIST also has an important role beyond the measurement. From its creation, the word standards has always been a key element of both its name and function. As technologies have changed since 1903, so have standards issues. Until the 80s, standards were considered to be a purely domestic issue. With the growth of international trade and technological corporations, or international corporations, in new technology sectors, this began to change. Our understanding of the importance of international impact of standards has accelerated over the past 20 years with the globalization of technological innovation. Today, technical standards are a key part of the innovation puzzle. The focus of today's hearing is to ask what NIST's role should be in coordinating federal government standards policy development. I want to make it clear that this committee has no interest in telling private sector standards developers how to do their jobs. This committee has always been Congress's strongest proponent for the public-private sector partnership that defines the U.S. standards development system. And today's hearing is addressing issues that we hope will streamline federal government's participation in the private sector-led standards system. I would like to thank our witnesses for taking the time from their busy schedules to appear before the committee today. And now I recognize Mr. Smith for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gordon, thank you for calling this hearing today on the structure and authorities of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerates the power of Congress to, quote, fix the standard of weights and measures, unquote. For over 100 years since its initial founding as the National Bureau of Standards, NIST has been congressionally authorized to fulfill this mission and is trusted domestically and internationally as an unbiased arbiter of scientific measurement. As we are continually reminded, scientific innovation is never ending, and the infrastructure needed to ensure continued advancement evolves likewise. In light of this, from time to time, NIST has seen fit to reorganize itself to better meet the needs of the scientific and commercial communities. This evolution is entirely appropriate so long as NIST remains within its authorization and is better able to meet its mission. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses on how this reauthorization fits those parameters. With that said, in the interest of hearing from our witnesses, I simply say thank you to the panel for going a ways out of your way to join us here today and share your expertise, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And those members that aren't here today will have an opportunity to submit questions for the record. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. First, the Honorable Patrick Gallagher is the Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Dr. James Serum is the President of Scitek Ventures, LLC, and the past Chair of the NIST Visiting Committee on Advanced Technology. And Dr. Craig Shank is the General Manager of Interoperability at Microsoft. Dr. Philip Wennblom is the Director of Standards at Intel Corporation. And our final witness is Mr. Updegrove, who is the partner of Gesmer, Underprobe. Now, I'm sure I have garbaged all your names and your businesses, but you're welcome to correct the record as we go forward. And as you know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony or anything within that reason. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. And when you complete your questions, then we will begin, or rather your statements, we will begin some questions here. So, Dr. Gallagher, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Since my written testimony has been submitted, what I'd like to do this morning is to briefly and rather informally highlight some of the major points in that and look forward to the questions. There were two fundamental topics in today's hearing, and for me they both deal with how NIST can most effectively carry out its mission. So first let me discuss the reorganization. The reorganization that I have proposed for NIST actually has two components to it. The first is the organization reporting directly to the director's office, if you will. The current structure has 17 line organizations that all report to the director or deputy director of the agency. I have proposed that this is an unwieldy and unstable structure because of significant turnover in those positions. And the new structure proposes to organize NIST by eliminating the current deputy director position and replacing it with 3 associate director directors, each with responsibility over major program elements of the agency. So one for the laboratory programs, an associate director for our external programs, which includes Baldrige, MEP, and the Technology Innovation Program, and one for management resources, which covers the administrative and support functions of the agency. This proposed reorganization has been approved by the Department and by the Administration and is currently being evaluated by our appropriations subcommittees. The other reorganization that I have announced that I am considering, and I've also initiated internal planning for, is a realignment of the laboratory structure at NIST. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, this structure has been in place since the late 1980s. I have been working in a very unorthodox fashion here. Normally, reorganizations are proposed and approved and not announced until they've gone through this process. I believe that I wanted to seek broad input, and so I've worked closely with the NIST leadership team, with the Visiting Committee on Advanced Technology, with key stakeholder organizations, with our own Department of Commerce, and with your staff from this committee as well. After reviewing input from all of them, my initial assessment is that it is time to realign the laboratories, and what I have proposed is creating a structure that's based on organizations that are organized by mission. This would create vertically integrated structure where a single laboratory would be responsible not only for the basic R&D activities that support that, but also for the measurement services that help carry out the mission of the agency. So this would make organizations much more customer-focused and responsive. A realignment of the type I'm proposing will not change the focus of the NIST programs. This does not set us on a new direction. It's designed to make the agency more effective. Nor does it result in any reductions in force. I am working closely with all of our stakeholders to develop a proposal that would go to the Department and the Administration for approval, after which it would be sent, of course, and shared with Congress for consideration. On the standards issue, the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act and its implementation under OMB Circular A119 defines NIST's role and tells federal agencies that they are to prefer to use standards developed by the private sector through a voluntary consensus process. This piece of legislation, which this committee played a key role on, has been remarkably successful in having agencies replace government-written standards with those developed in the private sector. However, today the pace of technology is changing ever with greater speed. The technology itself is becoming more complex, and our solutions to major policy issues are dependent on technology itself. So there are two major questions that we're facing. One is how do we work more effectively with industry and the private sector on developing standards, and how do we work more effectively across agencies to coordinate our work. And so in my written testimony, I've identified, discussed some of our experience on smart grid, I think Smart Grid has broken new ground as a public-private partnership that can be very effective. It includes committed leadership by all the participants. It's an effective partnership model with an active governance. There's strong coordination among the participating federal agencies, and it brings outstanding technical capability to bear. We are also working to improve the interagency coordination, and to that end, I'm working very closely with the Executive Office of the President, especially OSTP and OMB, to develop a more strategically focused interagency process where we can address specific standards-related issues and policy topics. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for this hearing, and I look forward to our question and answer session where I can address any other issues.
Mr. Serum is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon and Ranking Member Smith, for the opportunity to testify today on matters related to the organizational realignment and the future role of NIST in coordinating federal agencies in standards. My name is James Serum, and I'm president of Scitek Ventures, a science and technology consulting firm. I've been engaged in developing and commercializing measurement technologies for about 40 years, having spent most of my career with Hewlett-Packard. I've served on associated with NIST for about 12 years, having first served as a member of the NRC assessment panel, and in 2004 I was appointed to NIST Visiting Committee on Advanced Technology, and for the last 2 years have served as its chairman. In most cases, the comments expressed in this testimony are my own, but in some cases, especially related to NIST's role in standards, I also reflect the opinions of the VCAT as represented in the recently submitted annual report. I'll begin by addressing the topic of the proposed NIST organizational realignment. The first question that must be asked is, why do a realignment? NIST is a broad-based, diverse organization involving fundamental research technology, standards development, and managing programs for research funding and quality management. These activities have evolved over the years, but the underlying NIST organizational structure that supports them has not seen major change in, as you've said, for about 20 years. Much of the organization is discipline-focused, for example, in physics and in chemistry, yet many of the current goals and priorities are application or mission-focused. An effective, efficient organization must have clearly defined responsibilities, single ownership of goals, and accountability for achieving results. Key priority programs must have visibility in all levels of the organization. The head of the organization needs to clearly understand the business priorities, desired outcomes, and capabilities both in people and other assets, and then optimize the organizational structure to best meet its goals. I believe that Dr. Gallagher well understands these criteria, and his proposed realignment reflects this understanding. Dr. Gallagher has proposed a reorganization that I believe will result in a more effective operation and accountability for all departments. The laboratories will report into one associate director, and within the laboratories, a mission-based structure will bring all elements of the mission together, including technology development, standards, calibration services, and reference data. High-priority, industry-focused programs and cross-cutting programs would gain top-level visibility and coordination through a program office under the Associate Director for Laboratory. I'm fully supportive of Dr. Gallagher's proposed restructuring. I was also asked to address the question of my support for the Director of NIST to also hold the rank of Undersecretary, similar to that structure at NOAA. In general, I think this is a very positive change both for the NIST organization and for the Director, in that it brings parity with his peers in the Commerce Department and allows the Director to participate in all the activities afforded to an Undersecretary. I would only be concerned if the Director received significant additional responsibilities with the new title that diverted his attention from the very important challenges that NIST faces in the coming years. Finally, I would like to express a high degree of confidence in the NIST Director and his ability to structure the organization to meet its goals and objectives. Dr. Gallagher has a deep understanding of emerging technologies, the organization's strengths and weaknesses, and a clear plan to meet the challenges that NIST faces in the coming years. The VCAT also has affirmed their confidence and support of Dr. Gallagher in their annual report. In consideration of the role of NIST in coordinating federal agency activities, it seems natural that they would play a major role. The development and maintenance of standards is not only a core competency at NIST, it's a major element of their mission statement. Together with their competency in measurement technology, NIST drives and coordinates standard practices and processes throughout much of the U.S. industries. For example, documentary standards are recognized as a critical element in the successful implementation of the energy smart grid, healthcare information technology, and the cybersecurity programs. NIST is already deeply engaged in coordinating standards activities in these industrial segments, and the VCAT has described these activities and its recommendations in its 2009 annual report. The VCAT believes that the coordination role taken on by NIST in the area of smart grid should be used as a model and applied to other areas of national priority where standards development is required. It is clear from my examples in my written testimony that NIST's technical expertise, its reputation as an unbiased and neutral party, and its extensive participation in standards and conformity assessment activities strongly positions NIST to address the standards-related challenges of the 21st century and helping the U.S. maintain a competitive advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Serum. And now we'll hear from Mr. Shank.
Thank you, Chairman Gordon. Chairman Gordon, Ranking Member Smith, my name is Craig Shank. I'm the General Manager of the Interoperability Group at Microsoft. As a global innovator with over 2 decades of experience in the development and implementation of technical standards, Microsoft appreciates the opportunity to participate in this important hearing. Effective technical standards can help promote innovation, fuel market growth, and drive corresponding job development. The information and communication technology, ICT, marketplace changes rapidly. New and competing standards that are responsive to marketplace needs enable deployment of new solutions and encourage development of innovative products and services. Microsoft plays a dual role in standardization activities. We actively contribute innovative technology to standardization in many technology areas. As an example, we've recently contributed a Microsoft technology called User Interface Automation that helps developers build products like screen readers and voice recognition that provide essential accessibility to computers and the Internet to those with significant vision, hearing, or other learning needs. In addition, we sit on the other side of the table as our products, from Windows to Xbox and beyond, implement thousands of standards that are formulated by a broad diversity of standards bodies. This balance, sitting on both sides of the standards fence, frames our perspective. A diverse standards ecosystem that supports multiple technologies is good for U.S. and global economic growth. It's also worth noting that the computing experience itself is undergoing a powerful transformation as consumers, governments, and businesses are harnessing computing power in what's called the cloud, with new innovative products and services and broad-based communications. New businesses will form because any small group of developers at this stage can create content or software and have it available instantaneously in the global marketplace. With this new opportunity comes corresponding new responsibility, including the need to protect privacy of users, the security of their data, and to enable interoperability between systems, all areas where standards can play an important role. NIST has already provided engineering taxonomies that have been important in helping support cloud standardization efforts. We see NIST as a key player in the standards ecosystem. Its expertise and involvement are highly valued by the private sector. With regard to NIST, the subcommittee posed 2 related questions for this hearing. The subcommittee's first question seeks perspectives on the proposed NIST realignment. NIST will be placing standards professionals within each of its labs, so they'll be linked to the relevant technology experts. We also understand that NIST will create a coordination team among these standards professionals. NIST is also proposing broadly a more effective executive management structure. We believe that the proposed reorganization of NIST will enhance NIST's overall effectiveness in meeting its mission and objectives, including in the standards system. The subcommittee's second question asks what role NIST should play in technical standards within the federal government. As background, President Obama's administration has identified a number of very complex technology policy areas, such as smart grid, healthcare IT, and cybersecurity, that impact many different stakeholder groups. All of those are areas where standards can play an important supporting role. The current voluntary market-driven standards system has the tools it needs to create standards to help accomplish these policy objectives. At the same time, in these key policy areas, there is a role for an active convener of the key stakeholders, so together they can assess standards-related needs, frame solutions to address these challenges. We believe that NIST, based on its standards expertise and its reputation as a neutral, science-based organization, can serve as this convener. As a convener seeking to develop a standards framework to support U.S. government technology objectives, NIST should define the problems using specific use cases and scenarios, identify and bring together relevant stakeholders to build consensus on frameworks and outcomes, and then report back to those stakeholders. NIST's work in developing its framework and roadmap for smart grid interoperability standards exemplifies this approach. NIST can also serve in a separate convener role to facilitate the exchange of information and collaboration among federal agencies on domestic and international standards policy issues, and on federal agency engagement in international technical standards development efforts. It would be helpful for the U.S. government to articulate a unified position or be mindful of differing viewpoints, especially when engaging in international standards bodies. In closing, I'd like to thank you for giving us the opportunity to testify today. Microsoft appreciates NIST's valuable contributions to standardization. And certainly we at Microsoft look forward to working with you and the broader standards community, including my colleagues here at this table, to preserve and promote a vibrant, collaborative, and effective standards ecosystem. Thank you.
Mr. Wennblom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I'm Philip Wennblom, and I manage the Corporate Standards Office at Intel Corporation. Standards are important to Intel's business and to the information and communication technology industry overall. And as a result, Intel has a strong interest in the health of the standardization system in the United States and globally. Intel and our industry are primarily interested in global standards, standards that are developed to address global requirements and which are ultimately adopted around the world. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology has very important roles in the standard system. NIST is an active and expert participant in developing standards through involvement by 400 or so of its employees, and the participation of those employees is highly valued. NIST has a role in public and private coordination on priority areas of standardization, for example, the current work on smart grid. And I would emphasize that these types of efforts to convene the public and private sectors to coordinate require a large amount of effort and should be considered exceptional. They should represent areas where policy priorities are for the government, areas where NIST has strong expertise, and where there's a need for public and private coordination. NIST also has an important role to coordinate among federal agencies on standardization development on policy topics, a role that's been described in the NTTAA. I support Dr. Gallagher's plans for reorganizing NIST, and I believe these changes will strengthen the important roles that NIST plays in standardization. The changes should improve management stability and customer orientation, and the director's examination of strengthening the interagency coordination role is also well considered. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to be here, and of course I'll be happy to take questions when we get there.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Updegrove.
Chairman Gordon, Ranking Member Smith, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic. My name is Andrew Updegrove, and I'm a partner in the Boston law firm of Gesmer Updegrove. I'm also on the board of directors of the American National Standards Institute, but the opinions I will express today are mine alone. Those opinions are primarily informed by my experience in representing almost 100 nonprofit membership organizations that develop and or promote standards over the last 22 years. I will seek to frame my testimony today in the context of three important areas where standards play a crucial role: achievement of policy goals, maintaining national competitiveness, and ensuring the efficient use of taxpayer dollars. Let me begin by addressing the standards-related dependencies of public policy today. Over the last 100 years, our bottom-up, private sector-led standards development structure has served this nation well. This approach was wisely affirmed, as we all know, and strengthened by Congress in 1995 when it passed the Technology Transfer and Advancement Act. But today the world is changing in ways that I believe require us to optimize this bottom-up partnership to ensure that it continues to be as effective as it has been in the past. As we become ever more dependent on technology in general and the Internet in particular, thousands of new standards have been required to simply make things work. Major policy initiatives such as the smart grid and lowering the costs of health care through the adoption of electronic health records are each dependent upon the availability of scores and often even hundreds of standards, many of which did not exist when these initiatives were launched. Unfortunately, while the private sector is capable of developing individual standards quickly for specific purposes within a single sector, it lacks the will to tackle complex cross-sectoral challenges rapidly, or at least as rapidly as we need them to accomplish it today. This is in part due to what you would expect would be difficulties of resolving competing economic interests, which will not always be closely aligned on every standard that needs to be created. While adequate cross-sectoral solutions can and usually do evolve over time, urgent challenges such as cybersecurity and the rising cost of health care do not permit us the luxury to allow normal market forces to provide solutions. As a result, when the national interest demands the rapid deployment of wide cross-sectoral range of coordinated standards, I believe a catalyzing force is needed. And note this well. Challenges such as the smart grid and electronic health records are but the advanced party of a host of similarly cross-sectoral complex standards-dependent challenges that policymakers will face in the future. To whom can Congress turn when it determines that multiple industry sectors must be motivated to provide the standards tools needed to address ambitious policy goals? In the examples noted above, the answer has been clear: to NIST. Let me turn to national competitiveness. The development and deployment of standards is essential to creating new technologies and new product markets, and therefore to jobs creation and maintaining a healthy balance of trade as well. This lesson has been not lost on governments abroad. In particular, policymakers in the European Union and China have integrally woven standards development adoption into their national strategies. Indeed, in 2005, a U.S. aerospace industry working group concluded, without a clear strategy and support from industry and government space agencies, the U.S. is in the process of ceding the development of standards for the commercial space industry to venues outside of our influence. The Chinese government has observed this process and today is sponsoring the creation of more and more homegrown standards for the benefit of its domestic industries. This is especially worrisome because standards are essential to every emerging area of potential managing growth, job growth on the horizon today. But how are we to achieve such sophistication without abandoning our bottom-up model? The answer, I believe, is to charge a single agency or department with the role of tracking emerging needs for public-private coordination, with marshaling facts and data for lawmakers and the administration to support the development and deployment of standards-aware international trade policy, and with providing a coordinating function between the public and private sectors. Again, I would submit that NIST is the right tool for this job. Lastly, let me highlight the relevance of standards to the efficient use of resources. There is no argument that widely adopted standards create competition, increase product choices, and drive costs down. Hence, supporting the development of standards can have a very material impact in lowering government costs directly in procurement, especially where any agency can buy products from a single approved vendor list. This same support can also lower costs indirectly because government-side standards adoption allows information to be entered once and then exchanged widely, securely, and rapidly across departments and agencies. Because of the immense soft power of government purchasing, government can also provide incentives to industry to move rapidly in directions that are beneficial to society in general, such as towards greater cybersecurity and towards greater accessibility for those with disabilities. Turning very briefly to the questions posed, why is coordination among federal agencies important? Achieving goals such as protecting homeland security and making government more open can only be achieved through standards. I can expand upon that if necessary, but suffice it to say that without standards, these goals simply cannot be achieved. What could the future role of NIST be? Quite clearly, NIST can be capable of running policies such as the smart grid. And I think if I were to leave you with one message today, the role of NIST is essential in meeting these complex challenges such as the smart grid. And I believe that it is important that that be institutionalized in cooperation with private industry. In conclusion, I'd like to thank the chairman and the subcommittee members for inviting me to speak to you today, and I look forward to the progress that you will make in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll begin the questions, and the chairman will recognize himself. I think that Mr. Smith and I would hardly concur that there ought not be a federal office of winners and losers. And that it seems to me that you're all saying that there does need to be some coordination, and that NIST is a good place for that, and the word convener has been used. Now, what I want to better understand is sort of this chicken and the egg. Should NIST say, well, folks, we need to convene, so y'all come on over here? Or does the private sector go up and say, we're having some problems, NIST, will you help us convene? How do we say that it looks like some other countries are trying to get ahead of us in setting international standards? How should we, let's convene and take a lead in that. So, what is the chicken and the egg? Mr. Shank, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Chairman Gordon. It is tempting to answer between those two. The answer is yes. Deciding which things that NIST may play an active role in is actually one of the convener's role in is actually one of the real challenges with this, and is determining where one acts. I do think that in anticipating how we may go about this, how NIST may play a role, one of the key aspects of playing the convener across stakeholders may be conducting periodic landscape reviews, because I know that one of the things that that people are focused on here is not just having a backward-looking approach to the problems that NIST may be able to help fix, but a forward-looking role in the areas where convening these stakeholders can proactively help to initiate things. I believe that my slightly tongue-in-cheek answer, yes, really actually does need to be the case, and that is that with the ongoing capability to run landscape review comes engagement with stakeholders, where stakeholders may identify key areas. We may also see NIST identifying or Congress identifying key areas. An aspect that is important from Mr. Wennblom's testimony is that these do take up significant public and private resources, so we need to be thoughtful about the specific areas that we do engage in, that NIST engages in, because they can be very expensive. I think those need to be largely exception-based, but there are areas that are important enough to merit that.
Well, why don't we let Dr. Gallagher, we'll get out of the hypothetical, and why don't you tell us where is this chicken and egg, and then maybe the industry folks could react to that.
Great. Thank you. I actually see the answer is and, but I think there are actually two distinct cases. I think the question about when a government takes a stronger role in convening or coordinating on a standards effort actually touches on what is the purpose of the standard. And I think in many cases what we're looking at are standards that are needed for achieving government goals. In the case of Smart Grid, I think NIST took a proactive lead in initiating the convening role, because to address our energy needs, we had to stimulate and have a standard structure in place that would be viable for, let's say, regulation or for conditions under federal grants and assistance and so forth.
And same with health IT.
Same with health IT. Same with cybersecurity. So I think there are many cases where the government's need for technology is going to be manifested in terms of needing to have a certain structure of standards in place, and that's a case where we're going to want to be more proactive, and maybe the chicken is first. I think there's also cases where industry is going to drive this and be requesting of us a greater participation because maybe of an impasse or because of an international issue, and those types of scenarios play out as well. So I think we can be both initiated by industry and initiated by government need.
Anyone else want to comment on this?
If I may, please. I think that an important thing to be realized is that the standard-setting infrastructure is about 100 years old. And for most of that time, it was created to basically solve problems within silos. It's currently faced now with a reality where silo solutions don't work anymore. And private industry, in my opinion, has not really figured out ways to do things that cross many different sectors. It's getting better. It is coming up with a mechanism of setting profiles, and you're increasingly seeing new consortia set up not to set standards, but to create profiles of standards to address use cases. And if that sounds like the smart grid, it should, because it's basically the same type of exercise. The problem is that private industry is good at coming up with those to handle still fairly discrete problems. It takes an enormous amount of impetus, an enormous amount of organization, and an enormous amount of sometimes motivating dollars to pull together something of the magnitude of the smart grid. So I think that that's the first main area where government realizes that without government, it's just not going to happen. The second thing is I think that there will be standards that are of special interest to government, and maybe a good example would be open government. I've spoken at times about comparing standards to civil rights legislation, that if you're disabled and you can't log on to a website, the more government saves money by transitioning to a web-based interface with the citizenry, you can effectively be disenfranchised if you can't operate the technology to interoperate with government. And that might be a second category where the involvement of government might be appropriate.
Let me, before I run out of time here, let me get to the threshold question. Really, we posed two questions to you, and one was, as Dr. Gallagher, I think said, and I agree, in a transparent way, he's telling you up front where he's seeing this thing going. And so that's one question. You know, having viewed that, would the industry panel members raise your hand if you think that that is the right direction? Okay, so the record will show they all do. And then the second one is, do you think that the NIST director should be elevated to the second, to an undersecretary position, and raise your hand? Once again, we have concurrence. So I have some more areas of interest, but okay. Well, I'll get to one more. Well, one area that is very a real theme, I think, in this committee has been competitiveness. And we recognize that we have a global economy now, and how do we compete in that area? And we recognize that innovation, in this case, sometimes standards, leads to new technologies, and that leads to jobs. We're seeing that governments abroad and policymakers abroad, particularly in the EU and China, often integrate their standards with their national strategies. I think that can be dangerous sometimes, in that if you think that the government knows everything and they take the wrong course, then that's a problem. But it also can get their assets together well and make them, be able to pull together all their assets. So let me ask you, from your experiences in a global market, what are you seeing the disadvantages and advantages of, or first of all, I guess we should say, do you see EU and China doing these things? And if so, what are the advantages and disadvantages, and what are the lessons that we should learn? And whoever would like to start. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's a very important topic, and I would agree with your characterization of the approach that we see in Europe and China. It is more government-directed and government-driven, and I suppose a benefit of that approach is when the government would like to see a standard put in place, there's a very direct way to make that happen. However, if you step back and look at the results, I believe that the system we enjoy in the U.S. has been quite successful and continues to be successful despite this different approach that we see taken in other places. As I mentioned, our industry in information and communication technology really relies on standards to be globally adopted. So it's not enough to have a standard implemented in one country. We need to see standards that nearly all countries will adopt. And the market-driven system in the U.S., where we have industry and government standards, research, the market-driven oriented system has been very, very successful in taking standards which have become popular in the U.S. and having them adopted globally. And I don't believe it's under imminent threat from more government-directed systems.
Assume that a lot of that in the past has been because we've been a dominant market. So if we're not such a dominant market in the future, can we still rely in that way?
We may not be as dominant a consumption market, but still industries which are based in the U.S. are often very global companies that are participating in markets around the world. And when those companies are participating in standards process that's market-driven, I see impact globally on aligning around technologies. And if a single country wants to pursue its own agenda, it's difficult for that to be successfully adopted globally.
Okay, does anyone? Yes, sir.
I'd take a slightly different approach, but I agree that I think the private sector system is working extremely well in the standards area. So I think that there are two discrete areas where I think optimization would be required. In the first place, I think you made a very good point about the size of the American market. To date, the United States has had a very disproportionate impact on the setting of standards in areas such as information communications technology. There are in existence today something north of 500 standards consortia, not counting the traditional standards bodies that have been created to set standards in this area. I've helped set up about 100 of them, and I would say that out of that 100, 2 have been primarily led by foreign companies, and every last single one of the rest of them, the leadership came from major international corporations headquartered in the United States. I think we sometimes forget the enormous benefit that American industry has had from having those standards efforts launched to serve at the outset the strategic interests and goals of American industry. People abroad are starting to become aware that other people can play that game. China, in particular, with 1.3 billion people, has very much realized that all the patents are owned in the West, and they're tired of paying patent royalties to build products to sell to their own people, while they make 10 cents, on a DVD player and ship it off to the West, where somebody makes $5 on the patent royalties plus a markup on the device. This is going to change. And when you have that many consumers, the game is very clear to learn how to play. I saw in the US ITO report just last week, 3 new standards consortia were formed in China. Last year, there might have been 3 in the entire year. So I think one of the things that we might not realize until it's gone is when other people start playing the same game. And when American companies that used to start consortia here are looking at that big a market, they won't have any choice but to play the Chinese game.
Well,
the same
that's
way.
why I see that problem. So my question is, what are the answers?
I think here's where we need to have better communication between private industry and government, so that private industry can alert and, frankly, I think recruit government to assist it in trying to stay ahead on the trade policy ways, particularly, I would say, through enforcing our rights under the WTO and the Technical Barriers to Trade Act, that these things don't get ahead of us and get to the point where they were with WAPI and Wi-Fi, where we have to bring out the big guns to help get us back to the center line.
Okay, well, let's just complete this thought. Anybody else want to wade in here?
I think I would echo Mr. Updegrove's comments about thinking about both the trade attribute and the standardization attribute as related, but not necessarily the same thing going on. In the trade side, we do have the WTO as a vehicle. We'd like to make sure that we are alert, looking forward, looking into those things proactively, so that we don't end up too late in the game. On the standardization side, I think one of the things that is a theme that should run along with that is the effort to draw some of these nations into the global standard system, where there is an opportunity to compete effectively using the global competitive environment as opposed to a single country environment. So that's where we see an opportunity to use the existing private standard system, but use it on a global basis as a matter of global competitiveness.
Yes, sir.
Just quickly, back to the question of the coordination of standards. Very often, once a technology comes into play, it's the question of how long does it take for companies, private sector, and public bodies to come together to think in one fashion before you dominate the industry. And I think the very question of being nimble by coordinating standards, and again, I referenced the smart grid. A few years ago, it looked like an almost insurmountable problem to get everybody to agree on an architecture and a model of how we would go about it. And if we can use that as a model for other high priority opportunities, I think that can make a dramatic difference in our competitiveness, because we can be standardized in a much faster pace.
Thank you. And Mr. Smith is recommended for as much time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again to the panel. You know, it reminds me of certainly my objective of serving, that is to create more opportunity or ensure opportunity, not get caught up with the outcome necessarily. And I see each and every one of you as having a vital role in that. And I would say certainly within the private sector represented here today, you have probably given more opportunity to people, whether it's the young people in the audience or large companies. But I appreciate the prosperity that some have experienced as a result of more opportunities along the way. And so I think that certainly I would say we have the existence of NIST as a way to not only ensure opportunity, but to ensure competition, and not only to make sure that competitors in the private sector compete, because I think that we have a good bit of that. I also think that we want to ensure that we have a competitive industry domestically to compete in the world marketplace, and I think that we can have a discussion not only today but in the future of how we can leverage that. I do want to add that I'm concerned that some of the pending policies, and I won't get into those today, but I'm concerned that some pending policies that are out of the control of each of you, but they might stifle innovation. They might stifle opportunity, and that concerns me a great deal, not only for the future of our country, but for the future of every individual. So with that, I might just touch on a few things. Dr. Gallagher, how will the proposed Director's Office reorganization support improving this interaction with industry and academia to support competitiveness, and what do you have planned to help America compete, and will this reorganization make a difference to American competitiveness?
Great. Thank you for the question. I believe that the reorganization will actually make a very substantial difference in how NIST is interacting with industry, which is its primary stakeholder. And the reason for that is simple. It has to do with accountability. The real difference in the organizational structure that I'm proposing is not at the technical level. The NIST scientists and engineers will continue doing some of the world-class work that they've done, but the leadership now will be very directly held responsible for carrying out a portion of our mission. Since our mission is to work with industry, I think the major outcome of this is to make them very acutely focused on how their services, whether it's measurement services that they're providing out of one of our technical laboratories, or whether it's our technology services in promoting new technologies, developing standards, their job description now is really based on how well they carry that out. And so what I think it does is it creates much stronger ties between the NIST leadership and industry leadership. That's been the relationship that I clearly wanted to strengthen. And I think that, as you've heard a little bit just in the standards arena, I view the job of NIST as to allow the conditions for competitiveness and opportunity to take hold. So in many cases, what we're talking about is an enabling infrastructure. In other words, it creates the business or technology conditions for companies to innovate and generate new products, to have global markets available to them, to have a supply chain that they can work with. It's about putting that trust into those relationships. And viewed that way, this is about creating an environment where we can make and compete and still be the #1 country in the world for developing new products and services. And I think that translates to jobs and economic prosperity in a very direct way.
Very good. Thank you. Now, just a point of clarification. It sounds like there would be a net increase of senior level positions at your shop?
Actually, no. It's not even a new layer of management. Currently, the existing organization has 17 line organizations that report to me through a deputy director. So while I'm replacing a single deputy director with 3 associate directors, there's going to be fewer or line organizations reporting in. So actually, it's not an increase in the number of executive positions.
Okay, or FTEs?
Not at all. There's no change.
Okay, I appreciate that. And again, I don't want to pretend to manage your shop there. I'm not qualified, #1, but certainly that's not what I see my role to be. But budgetarily, I just want to stay on top of things. You did mention some interagency coordination process. If you wouldn't mind elaborating on that, and especially if you might be able to share any discussions with OSTP, OMB, and USTR, just to use a few acronyms here today.
So thank you. So as I've looked at the standards coordination effort, as I said, it really has 2 major components. One is having a more robust set of models for how we work with the private sector. I mean, to oversimplify, historically we had either a very hands-off, we'll participate at a technical level, but it's really not managed at all, or we take over as a government and we write down standards ourselves. And I think the real attractiveness of the smart grid approach is that it represented a new type of model where you had a much more active engagement, and it really was a public-private partnership. Is that going to be the right approach for every standards question? The answer is definitely not. But I think in cases where you need those attributes of being able to define your needs very clearly and have some influence over the architecture, for example, for security in the smart grid, over the timeliness of the development, it's a very appropriate model. The other area has been how do you get, these technology systems are becoming very complex, and there's almost always a large number of agencies who have a stake in the outcome. And so we've been looking very carefully at how to improve the interagency coordination. And I've reached the conclusion that it has 2 ingredients. One is it has to have an agency like NIST, which has deep technical capabilities and understands the standards process. We in some way become the corporate memory for how to do standards-related activities. The other part of interagency coordination, though, is actually being able to direct agencies to get together, to mediate discussions and reach conclusions. And in my view, that's very much a White House function. And so what I've been doing is trying to work very closely with OSTP and with OMB and the U.S. Trade Rep to come up with a forum where we tie together the type of interagency process that we've had under the NTTAA. So there is a standing interagency coordination committee chaired by NIST, and couple it with a more strategic policy or leadership level driven interagency process that would come out and be managed by the White House. And I think by having NIST involved in both of those, we tie these processes together. It should give us the ability to have the active leadership participation when we need it and not lose any of the very active working level interaction that we currently have with the agencies.
Okay, thank you, sir. And a little bit outside the scope of the specific questions that you were asked to answer in your prepared testimony, if you wouldn't mind telling us what each of you, might believe are NIST's strongest contributions to American competitiveness and any areas where you believe NIST could use improvement, and especially as we reauthorize America Competes, what recommendations would you make to strengthen NIST? Maybe alphabetically? I don't know. Whoever wishes to. Go ahead, Mr. Wennblom.
As I mentioned, Intel and I believe industry appreciates when NIST comes to the table because invariably the NIST representative is an expert and makes sound contributions to the standards process. The area for improvement that I hear discussed among my colleagues is we want more of that. That there are some places where we'd like to have NIST participating in developing standards and they're not there. So I don't know if it's a criticism, but you know, if there's an opportunity to give NIST a bigger opportunity to participate in the standards process, I think that's something industry would appreciate and would ultimately make the U.S. more competitive.
Okay. Dr. Serum?
I'll refer back to the proposed reorganization, realignment in my comment. I think historically with a disciplined structure that has been in place, the NIST has done just, well, world-class research, and 3 Nobel Prizes have come out of it as demonstration of that. However, that research in the current structure is not as closely aligned to its deliverables with industry as it could be. And this is one of the reasons why I strongly support Dr. Gallagher's realignment proposal, because all elements of its impact on industry, the pioneering measurement technology that gets developed together with the necessary standards that the industry needs to be competitive, all are accountable within one organization, and the decisions can be made by a small group of people, made much more rapidly, and made synergistically with the outcome, the desired outcome, closely associated with the pioneering research. So I think that's probably a significant advantage of the new proposed structure.
Thank you. Mr. Shank?
Thank you. It's daunting to try to select NIST's strengths. So rather than select specific strengths, let me perhaps outline some general areas. Dr. Serum has identified the existing body of basic research capabilities. Certainly, Mr. Wennblom spoke to the importance of NIST's role in standards. I think the way that many of these have developed is that NIST has an independence that drives a credibility that allows NIST to participate across different stakeholders. It is what we sometimes call an honest broker's role. We do value that very much across the different industry participants and the other stakeholders. So we think that that's a key attribute to being able to play this convener's role and to being able to pull stakeholders together. As I look to areas that one might leverage out of NIST, certainly we've thought of rather than areas of improvement, the capacity to leverage that convener's role that is some of what we've spoken about here today. If I were looking to align resources at any organization on standards issues, one of the things that I would certainly think about is aligning the standards professionals very closely with the specific technology areas that are referenced, and it turns out that that's one of the things that the NIST realignment is designed to do. It will create that matrix of both close engagement with the specific missions on a technology basis, and then a capacity to coordinate that across different groups at NIST.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Updegrove?
First, I think the biggest strength of NIST in the context of the discussion we're having today in one way is just that there is an enormous pool of people that get standards. That's not very common across other parts of government. And all of a sudden, standards matter a lot more than they used to, and it's not the easiest thing to get up to speed. So it is the major resource available to government today to educate government about what it needs to know to support modern policy in the technology area. That would be, it's unmatched anywhere else in government. There are islands of competence on particular areas, but not this broad understanding. I would couple that with one concern, which is that many engineers are familiar with the traditional infrastructure which is run through national standards bodies, and much of the action today in the ICT sector is outside of that in the consortia that I mentioned earlier. And I think that not everyone in NIST is as conversant with that reality as they might be, and might be worth their while to be a bit more nimble in understanding that area. The last thing I would say is that it would ask NIST an awful lot to be the expert on every area of technology. I guess I would sort of leave a hanging question whether government either needs to really empower NIST much more, or at least realize there's only so much NIST can do to support government in an era where technology is as important as it is today, and where something as relatively arcane as standards is important to know how to play the game very well in order to support the national interest. I think it's absolutely the place to start. I'm not sure I see the end of the solution and how to make sure we can do everything. A final thought, when you look at Europe, Europe has spent 40 years trying to knit together an increasing number of countries. One of the first things they had to do was to break down the trade barriers between each individual country. And one of the ways they did that was by breaking down the standards-based barriers. So Europe had a huge problem that government had to solve by understanding standards. You look at China. China very much understands it has a huge problem it needs to solve by understanding standards. They're throwing billions of dollars and literally thousands of people at that. We've been rather lucky in that we haven't had a big challenge that we needed to solve with standards. The smart grid is maybe the first example, electronic health records. I think that government should really use these as learning experiences to understand what government needs and how NIST can support it in understanding these, looking ahead, planning for them, and then solving them as effectively as possible.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, and certainly we oftentimes forget about consumers, both domestically and elsewhere, and I'm glad that that's part of the discussion. We won't get into a whole bunch of trade policy here, but I know that competitiveness is a big issue because we want folks to flourish here at home as they might be able to provide a higher standard of living overseas and the stability that comes along with that. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. That's a very good line of questioning. As we mentioned earlier, competitiveness is a big theme of this committee, and I think to be competitive and to be successful, we have to be worldwide competitive. Let me, this committee, I think, really works hard at trying to be a committee of consensus, and I've heard the word consensus in rulemaking there a lot. And I think, again, the minority, majority, our staff, we all have to work together at this, and we're reasonably successful. But I think that both minority and majority both have honorable folks, a couple of them though on each side that sort of zig when everybody else zags, and you just can't always get them on the same page. So you're trying to develop these consensus standards, and for a parochial interest or for whatever other reason, somebody just doesn't agree. So how do you say tough luck and move on? Dr. Gallagher.
Well, I think in general the voluntary consensus process that's used doesn't take consensus to mean unanimity. In fact, it allows for a plurality of views. It's really designed to make sure that different viewpoints, different technologies, different solutions get to the table. In other words, making sure that the process doesn't drive exclusivity. But in fact, the process has shown itself to be very capable of making decisions that, in fact, don't make everybody happy. And I think that's otherwise, I think you would result with the lowest common denominator in the standards, and that's not to our advantage either.
But finally, another thing that we've talked about here a lot is as we invest in R&D, as we invest in workforce development, and we have innovation that comes out with new technologies and new products, is how do we keep those here? And I know you didn't say that much in your oral statement, but in the written statement, you talked more about NIST's interest in the manufacturing sector and trying to coordinate it across. Tell us what you're going to do to keep, those dollars that we've invested in R&D here. How are we going to keep those products here also, or at least the manufacturing of those products here?
Yeah, I agree. I believe that the innovation framework we all discuss that is the basis for our deep investments in R&D ultimately depend on economic action at the other end. And so, in my view, I see that as culminating in manufacturing, making and developing new products and services. And I think, in fact, there's a relationship between our manufacturing ability and our research capabilities. And it's very important to this country that we be very competitive in that arena. I don't know that NIST will solve all of the problems there, but I think my approach is basically to throw every NIST authority and program I have and focus it on this issue. So I think, for example, in standards, we can do everything we can to make sure that the conditions are ripe for companies to develop new technologies, and that those standards are adopted as widely as possible on an international basis, so those markets that they build products to are available globally. I think we can work to make sure that the measurement infrastructure is in place so that companies can work with their supply chains, and we have trust in the system that components and things that are purchased, in fact, meet specification. I think we can work to drop barriers to technology transfer and make sure that ideas are getting out of the labs and into manufacturers and creating opportunities for them so that can be a basis for growth. Basically, making sure that the playing field is as fair as possible, as advantageous as possible, and I think Americans have shown when those are the conditions, we step up and we do very well, and I think that I have no reason to believe that won't be the case. So I really do view this as a broad spectrum approach at NIST. I would like to look at every program we have, from our manufacturing extension program to our measurement services to our technology innovation program, and make sure they're working in concert to try to maximize these opportunities for manufacturers.
Let me just conclude by, somewhat on this theme. I think there is a strong federal role for basic research that the private sector is not willing to invest or doesn't have the type of resources to invest in, particularly when you have quarterly returns and all these sort of things. That then is made available for the applied research where private sector takes it and moves forward. Any more thoughts on how we can make that better, how we can get this information to the private sector to be more productive? Or I guess maybe more particularly how NIST, any role they could play there? If there isn't, that's fine.
That's a tough question, but it's an age-old question of who is the right people to do fundamental research. But in my association with NIST for the past 12 years, I see areas where, and I understanding coming from industry, that many times it's just impossible to get the industry players together with a common cause that's bigger than themselves, and so by NIST playing that technology role in certain areas of driving new technologies that the other ones won't have or won't do, it can then get done. So I think it's a little bit of chicken egg problem again, but there is definitely a role for pioneering technologies in the government.
Yes, Dr. Gallagher.
Mr. Chairman, just one thought. As the committee works on reauthorizing America Competes, the one thought I would leave you is that this process of translating the ingenuity coming out of our labs into economic output, for me, is characterized by participation. In other words, at the basic research side, we have a pretty good idea of who does that work and who funds it. And at the commercial side, where it's actually being manufactured, we know that that's done in industry. I don't think there's one answer in the middle, and I think this has been something people have focused on for many, many years, the whole notion of tech transfer and commercialization. And I think we will continue to look for a variety of solutions, and it may turn out that there's not one answer. But the one thing I do know is that the magic seems to happen when we have mechanisms where there can be a mix of participation. So when government and university, national labs, and industry can work together in a variety of ways, that's what's happening in the middle. And so as the committee looks at the authorization language, one of the important issues that was in Competes was the role that the different agencies play, and in particular making sure that the vehicles are there where we can form those partnerships as appropriate to work together, because that's, I think, the key ingredient.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Ms. Smith, do you have anything else? Well, let me thank our witnesses for appearing here today. I think this was a very interesting hearing, and again, your work before this, and I'm sure that we'll be getting back with you as we try to put final touches on the Compete, will be important. Other members will have an additional 2 weeks to submit any type of questions and answers from you. And with that, witnesses are excused and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you. Have you got a couple of minutes?